Contents of today's webinar is like this. We're going to look at the difference between licensed data and open data. We're going to look at the end user license, who can use the service, what we can do with the data, publishing, sharing data, obligations and restrictions, what happens when the license terminates, getting support, and what do support staff and institutions need to do. Today I'm going to focus really on the Ordnance Survey license because that is the most complex of the Digimap collections. I will throw in snippets about the other licenses as we go through where I think it's useful, but for the most part this is focusing on the Ordnance Survey license. So what is the difference between licensed data and open data? We hear about open data all the time, and the difference is key. All the map data in Digimap's Ordnance Survey collection is created and supplied by Ordnance Survey. It only covers England, Scotland and Wales. Northern Ireland and Ireland, of course, have their own national mapping agencies, and they have separate data sets that they deal with in separate ways. What we're going to do today is to cover the terms and conditions that Digimap has for licensed data. There are some map products that are available under an OS open data scheme. This is covered by a different license, broadly known as the Open Government License. That does permit commercial use, and I think they're on version 3 now. There have been several iterations of it. So you can almost do, and I paraphrase here, what you like with the open data. Different Ordnance Survey products are covered by different licenses. So some of them are open data products and some of them are licensed products. And the data is either covered by one license or the other. There's no overlap. So you can't have one product that is affected by two licenses. So what we're going to concentrate on today is the licensed data. The open data is available through Digimap, and you can take it from Digimap, that's fine, and it is still subject to the open license. So how do you know if a data product is licensed data or open data? Within Roam, there is a map information panel on the left-hand side of Roam. You can open that and it will tell you which data license applies to the map that you're looking at. Similarly, in the data download service, you can find out what the license applies to the product that you're wanting to download if you look at the product information boxes for each product. Next to each product in the list on the left-hand side is an info button. If you click on that, it opens a little pop-up window that will tell you the terms of use and the data license in there. That in fact applies to all the collections. It will tell you which data license applies because BGS, whose data we have in the Geology Digimap service, also has some open data. Incidentally, for those of you who know that we have just launched a beta version of the new Roam facility, there is a map information panel in that. It's in a similar location. If you open the panel on the left-hand side of the map, you will find a map information panel in there, which will also give you this data license information. So the license agreements are structured as follows. At the moment, there is a master agreement between Ordnance Survey and GIST Collections. There is then a sub-license agreement that runs between GIST Collections and any subscribing institution. That sub-license passes on any rights, responsibilities and obligations that GIST need to pass on to the subscribing institution. There is then an end user license which runs between the end user, your student, your member of staff, whoever, and Ordnance Survey directly. That also puts rights, responsibilities and obligations onto the end user. All the licenses at the moment run until the 31st of July 2018. That of course ties in with your subscription year. So what is the end user license agreement? This is the bit that affects what the end user can actually do with the data that they download. So the EULA contains the terms and conditions under under which the user takes the data. When the user logs into Digimap for the first time and accesses a particular collection, they then have to accept the terms of that EULA before they can progress any further. They only have to accept the EULA once unless it changes. If it changes, it will be presented to them again and they then get a chance to accept the new version. The full agreement with FAQs and so on is all available in our Digimap Resources Centre. And we have a series of FAQs as well, which are updated when we need to update them. This license was last renewed in August of this year. There have been very few changes between last year's license and this year's license. I'll highlight those shortly to all intents and purposes, what you can do with the data hasn't changed. So the end user license agreement is in fact a legal agreement between the end user and the Secretary of State for Business Innovation and Skills. They are acting through Audit Survey. So the EULA has lots of sort of scary legal language in it, and it is a formal legal document. We hope that things like the FAQs and examples that we can give make it less scary. We also hope that the wording of the EULA is more accessible than it used to be. We're making progress in improving these as the years go by. The EULA allows you to have access to and to use the OS license data, but solely for educational use or limited administrative use. Those are capitalised terms, and therefore they have specific definitions in the EULA, and they are quite well defined. So who can use the license data? The EULA is based around this idea of an authorised user. An authorised user is an individual who, most importantly, is authorised by a subscribing institution to have access to its information services using what we call secure authentication. You also have to have completed EDINA's registration process for Digimap, and you have to have accepted the terms of the EULA. And the clarification, the definition of authorised user includes the stipulations that you must be a current student, a member of staff, or a consultant or contractor at the institution who's employed for teaching or research. There were some previous qualifications for this definition that have changed this year. This is the biggest change. In fact, it might even be the only change from last year's licence to this year's licence. Previously, authorised users were not eligible to have access to Digimap, or to use the data rather, when they spent extended periods abroad. That is no longer the case. So if you have sandwich year students who spend a year, 6 months overseas, they are allowed to continue accessing and using the OS data even though they are outside the UK. That used to not be the case. It is okay now. Similarly, staff and students who are registered at an overseas campus of a subscribing institution do now qualify as authorised users. That is quite a big change, because previously subscribing institutions which had overseas campuses were not allowed to give access to the OS collection to those students who were registered at overseas campuses. They can now do that. There are still other conditions that have to be satisfied, of course. You still have to be a current student, or a member of staff, or a contractor, or whatever. The qualification of the authorised user definition that hasn't changed is that consultants or contractors only qualify for the period necessary to fulfil their teaching or research. So, for example, if somebody is engaged to teach a particular course, and that course only lasts from January through till April, they will only be eligible to access the OS data for that period. Some more clarifications though. These are things we often get asked. Distance learning students now also qualify as authorised users as long as they meet the other criteria. Their location is no longer an issue. So in some cases we have found distance learning students who are based overseas, they are fully signed up to a course, they are now able to access the OS data. Previously they weren't. Another key point, it is up to institutions to decide whether any individual is eligible for a sort of membership status with them, and the institution is responsible for issuing authorisation credentials accordingly. So using the UK Federation Access Management System, this is entirely possible, where you can have a large group of people of whom different sectors of it have different access rights. So if your institution won't vouch for you and doesn't regard you as a proper full-blown member, and won't issue with the appropriate access rights for this particular service, then you can't become an authorised user. It's a bit like thinking of the subscribing institution as the passport authority, and they decide whether you get the passport that will let you into Digimap, or you don't get the passport that will let you into Digimap. The other key point is that you automatically cease to be an authorised user when you leave the subscribing institution. So, as I said, the end user license agreement is a proper legal document, and therefore it has a proper structure to it. The key sections I've highlighted in bold on this slide are sections 3, 5 and 6. Section 3 looks at permitted use. Section 4 is useful because it talks about public sector data sharing rights, and I'll come to that in a bit. Section 5 gives a list of obligations and restrictions, things you can't do and things you must do. Section 6 is about copyright acknowledgement and copyright statements and citations and so on. Section 8 tells you what happens when the license comes to an end. Section 11 is about warranties and liabilities. And Appendix 1 is also very useful because it's the list of definitions. Any term in the license which has a capital letter at the beginning of it is usually a definition. That's not a hard and fast rule, but if you see a capital letter in the middle of a sentence, it's probably making reference to something that is specifically defined. So the permitted uses are, broadly speaking, educational use, which covers teaching, learning, academic research, sponsored research, private study, which includes distance learning, and something that we call limited administrative use. Limited administrative use is in fact quite tightly defined, although often it is misinterpreted and stretched a little bit. It is intended to allow institutions to publish mapping in promotional literature to show things like the extent of the campus or an event location, to give directions from one building to the next for a particular group of students, or indeed to promote subscriptions to Digimap if you wanted to put up an example of what can be produced from Digimap as a good example of how a particular course or department might use it, then that's fine. You can incorporate mapping images in YouTube videos for demonstration and promotion of the service as well. So what can you do with the licensed data? This is very hard because we can't possibly produce an exhaustive list. There are all sorts of things you can do with it, as long as it fits within the bounds of educational use or limited administrative use. So some examples here are that you can incorporate the data into anything that one might regard as an academic work, so PhD theses, undergraduate review essays, projects, field work and so on, and that goes equally for teaching materials. If you set up a course with a set of labs, you can use the data and the materials and the maps to create those. You can publish maps in journals. There are no size limits on how much you can publish, but the images must be no larger than necessary to fulfill the purpose. So you can't gratuitously publish a map with the whole of the UK when it's not really necessary. More technically, you're allowed to display, view, interrogate, manipulate, modify, search, and otherwise use the licensed data, and you can print it, of course. If you're in any doubt about whether what you want to do is permitted or not, then please come and ask. We have a direct line to Ordnance Survey. They're very happy to help us identify whether something is in or out. In fact, they would rather that we ask, partly because it lets them know more about what their data is being used for, and they like to know that because it helps them to create better data, of course, but it also means that the more these sort of tricky ones are asked, the easier it is for us to identify where the ambiguities are in the license and for them to revise that. So what else can you do? You can download and store the data on any device. That includes your mobile phone, your laptop, your tablet, your mainframe, whatever it is that you happen to have. You can also supply copies of data to other authorised users, either at your own institution or at another subscribing institution. Key point here that I feel I have to flag is that it's up to you to establish whether they are or are not an authorised user. For most people, just saying, are you registered for Digimap is sufficient, but some people do like to come and check with us, and we can look people up if needs be. Doesn't happen very often. Most people take it on trust that they are registered. Although I don't think the sharing, in fact, happens very much. You're entitled to supply copies of data and receive data from organisations which are members of either the Public Sector Mapping Agreement in England and Wales or the One Scotland Mapping Agreement in Scotland. The Section 4 of the EULA gives you more detail about the reciprocal data sharing rights. The key there is that both you and the PSMA or OSMA member have to be licensed to hold and use the same area of data and the same product. So let's, for example, say you'd need a license to share, you need a license to the Edinburgh City Council's area for master map data, and the other party would also need to have a license for that very same area of that very same data set. You can also create navigational products and services as part of your course or your teaching work and so on. They are quite well defined in the license. It's worth looking those up if you're doing things like navigational apps and so on. But the resulting services can only be available to authorised users for the current academic year. So you couldn't create an app that would go on year after year after year. EULA section 3.4 is the one to look at there. You can deposit electronic copies of maps in your local institutional repository. So things like digital copies of PhD theses that get stashed away in repositories for future generations to enjoy are totally okay. Can you publish your maps? Yes, you can publish your maps. You can publish them either on paper or in electronic form, including on the web. There are some conditions to this. Mapping images must be in a raster format only. They mustn't be georeferenced. They must be no larger than necessary, and they have to include additional information. The idea is that anybody reading the said article or whatever that you've published should not be able to take the data and use it elsewhere. If it's georeferenced, it suddenly becomes data rather than just an image. So provided you can publish stuff, provided that you've also taken adequate steps to ensure that the third parties can't extract any data from the materials that you've published. That's my point. Social media is a bit of a grey area. You can now post map images to Twitter and YouTube and Facebook, but of course they mustn't be georeferenced. However, if you want to publish a map image in a book, they require a separate license, because this is our understanding, that books incur a royalty payment, and of course OS want the royalty for however many copies of the book that you might sell. Just as a point of clarification for those who might not be familiar with this, the license refers to raster formats and raster images and vector formats and vector images. Just to clear this up a little bit, a raster image is a mapping image made up of individual pixels where the information stored within each pixel corresponds to a value of some sort of that pixel only. It's also known as a bitmap or a static image. There isn't any intelligence, and none of the pixels know anything about the ones sitting next to them. There's no kind of cohesion to it in that sense. A vector image is a representation of the map made up of individual features and points and lines and areas and attributes which relate to the real world. In contrast to the raster, vector data is much more flexible and much more intelligent. Let's put intelligent in quotations there. It's a form of data which can be edited and modified without affecting what it represents. There's a quick image for you of the difference between raster and vector. I'm not sure that it says very much, but I hope that most people will get the broad idea. So can you share data? Yes, you can. You can share data with other authorised users, either from your institution or from other subscribing institutions. Note that both institutions must be subscribing. Going back to my earlier point, you can also only share with other authorised users. So you have to check that the person you want to share the data with is in fact registered with Digimap. If you're sharing data, you are obliged under the EULA to keep a written record of the names and addresses of people you're supplying the data to. You need to keep a record of what data you're sharing and when it was shared. And if asked, you need to provide the records. The EULA does specify that OS reserves the right to request sight of said records if they need to. In our experience, that has never happened, but there is always a first time. There is a key point to make here that points of interest data is included in the agreement, but you cannot share points of interest data. It's a slightly odd data set in that it is not entirely owned by OS. There are third-party rights in it, and therefore there are third-party rights that OS has to respect and has to pass on obligations from their own agreements. So if you're using points of interest data for anything, it's worth checking carefully the terms of the EULA that relate specifically to points of interest. Can I supply data to my research sponsors? You can supply final report with map images in it to your commercial sponsor, but you can't supply data to them unless that sponsor has a license from OS for the same data for non-commercial purposes. If big corporation X sponsors your PhD and pays you X amount of money per year to do a piece of research that they regard as for the common good, but they also request a copy of your work at the end of it, you can't give them the data because that is in effect potentially a cheap way for them to get hold of data that they would otherwise have to pay for. That's why you're not allowed to share the data, but you can share the images that go in your final document. You can supply data to government departments if they are public sector mapping agreement or One Scotland mapping agreement members and are licensed for the same map products for the same area. Then yes, you can share it. That's very easy. Most government departments are members of the PSMA or the OSMA, but do check whether the product and the area that you're licensed for matches up. Right, quick chance for me to breathe and for anybody to type any questions for Guy. I might give you a minute to think about whether there's anything you want to ask just now. So what are your obligations under this EULA? Key ones, you have to keep your login details secure. Most of this is fairly self-explanatory and intuitive. It's not in anybody's interest really to go sharing their passwords, particularly nowadays, since nowadays so many things are linked to a single password with the introduction of single sign-on systems and so on. You don't want somebody spending your lunch money just so that they can have a Digimap map. You need to keep data secure and not publicly accessible. By publicly accessible, that means basically not available to anybody who's not an authorized user. You have to keep records of any data you distribute, as we just talked about, and you also have to acknowledge the use of the licensed data. Copyright acknowledgement is a question we get asked about quite a lot. There is a copyright statement that needs to go on every Ordnance Survey map, and it looks like this. It's copyright, crown copyright, and database rights, and you need today's date in it, or the year at least, Ordnance Survey Digimap license. So there's an example where I've just put the year in there. I don't suppose it's a problem if you want to put a more specific date, but the year is an absolute minimum. The above acknowledgement is automatically included in all maps that you print directly from Roam. You'll also spot it on the Roam maps in the interface as well. So we do try to make it easy for people to tick that box under their obligations. Here's an example of it here. You can see in the red box at the bottom of the map, there is the copyright statement there. We also do a little thing that helps you to come up with the right citation to go in your list at the end of your article or your work. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. If you type in the various details, we can generate the citation, appropriate citation for you here. So this is one that relates to master topography data. This is what the citation tool looks like. You can get it from our resources centre as well. It's very straightforward. You type your name in, your title, and fill in the various boxes and click create citation, and boom, it will generate the right bit of text for you to copy and paste into your document. So what are the restrictions? Commercial use is completely out. Commercial use being a defined term in the license, but it broadly speaking is anything which generates profit. Check the EULA sections 5.1 and 5.2 for any specific restrictions. You can't create campus maps for web and mobile devices that contain georeferenced data, and you can't publish maps electronically that have vector data in it. This goes back to what we were saying earlier about the difference between raster and vector. You can't use OS data in mobile applications unless they are for educational navigation products or services, and they are specifically designed in the EULA as well. Do check section 3.4 of the EULA on that. And you can't use OS data where there is any paid for or free advertising. We did have a question once about advertising the location of an academic conference, and in fact it was a geo-related conference, and OS let that one through once they'd seen all the different materials that were going out. So if you've got something like that, it's worth coming to ask us about it, I think. As I said earlier, points of interest data is a slightly unusual data set in the grouping here. There are additional acknowledgements required that this material includes data licensed from point X. The license states that you can't use this for any form of sales or market research or geocoding or correcting gazetteers or address lists, and you can't share it with anyone. As I said earlier, this is to do with the third-party rights in it and what OS is allowed to sub-license effectively. Users have unlimited liability for infringements of IPR, whether it's either by themselves or by someone else as a result of the user failing to do something. This, again, has never cropped up, but it's a clause that is there and should be taken seriously. The question over derived data is fairly straightforward, that the rules applying to licensed data also apply to any data derived from the licensed data. So what happens when your license comes to an end? So this is what's going to happen if your institution ceases to subscribe, or if something goes horribly wrong, and a huge amount of transgression and terms are breached and the rest of it. If a license is suspended, terminated or expires, you have to stop using Digimap. Within 7 days you have to destroy any data in your possession, and within 7 days you have to remove any educational and navigational products or services that you have developed. You are allowed to keep hold of copies of material, printed copies of material, printed screenshots of any education navigation products or services that you have, and mapping images embedded within electronic documents and so on that you have archived or that are in your repositories and so on. They too are safe. Again, they have to be raster and not georeferenced. So you can keep the images, but you can't keep the data itself. So for support staff, what is the institution responsible for? This isn't directly about the EULA, this is really about what the institution signs up for when they take out a subscription and agree to the sub-license. There are data security requirements that are outlined in Schedule 3 of the sub-license document, which you can get from the GIS collections pages at the moment. That also defines roles for site reps and responsible officers for data security. A quick summary of these is basically that you must ensure that no unauthorized access to Digimap takes place, and no unauthorized access to the licensed data takes place. You need to nominate a site rep, at least one site rep, and you need to nominate at least one responsible officer for data security and their deputy. If there is anything you think is a potential breach of your license, or even if it's an actual breach or a potential breach, you need to tell us. The sooner you tell us, the better. Our experience tells us that the sooner we can address these things, the less serious they are. In the event of breaches of the license, there are a set of guidelines that we can follow to try and minimise any damage, if you like, but you're also required to help us investigate, and we need you to instigate any disciplinary procedures if that becomes necessary. It is rarely necessary, but the obligation is still there. There is an established set of procedures once a quotations incident has been identified. Timescales are also limited to 6 weeks. We understand that that isn't always possible, and therefore keeping in touch is the way we keep on top of that. All the details are given in Appendix 3 of the sub-license. These tend to be either user-related incidents or institution-related incidents. So, for example, an incident relating to a single user might be somebody sharing their password with friends or sharing data which they shouldn't have done. An institution-related incident might be more of a systematic failure on the institution's part to, say, switch off users when they graduate, for example. If you need help, we are here. There's the full text of the EULA and the license agreements are on the Digimap website. There are FAQs there too. There is a chat facility on all our help pages, and as usual, our help desk is available Monday to Friday 9 to 5, either by email, adina@ed.ac.uk, or by phone. If you want to get us on Facebook, you can. If you want to get us on Twitter, you can. All the details of how to contact us are on the Digimap website. And finally, another chance to ask any questions. I'm conscious of the time. If there are questions you have later that you would like to email to us directly, please feel free to do that. We'll have a transcript of any questions that have been asked here. They'll all be anonymous, but we will send those round along with the recording, a link to the recording of this and the slides, and we've prepared those to go on the website sometime next week. Do get in touch if you have any more questions, and thanks for listening.